Welcome everyone to our study of Journey Without Gold, the Tantric Wisdom of the Buddha. Good morning, La. So this is intended for us who wish to practice the Vajrayana path and to know what the Vajrayana path is about. And a key element really in this is that we need to really see the entire Buddhist teaching as a whole. And so there's nothing in the Buddhist teaching that is not present within Vajrayana. And we could also, in all the various, what we could call vehicles or yanas of the Buddhist teaching, we can see the Vajrayana nature of it. What we're doing with Vajrayana is clearly integrating a vision of the abiding, spontaneously present sanity or result of enlightenment as it abides within us and as it permeates the phenomenal world. But again, and I keep coming back to wanting to promote a talk that Songsa Jamin Khenze Rinpoche gave in Taipei Sunday Taipei time, and in there somebody asks, in view of all the recent events in Vajrayana Buddhism, do you think there's a chance that Vajrayana could be corrupted? And Rinpoche says, it has always been corrupted. And goes on to speaking about you should see that, and I won't pretend that I can accurately represent what Rinpoche was saying, but one point that I want to sort of point to here is Rinpoche says that Vajrayana is actually sometimes we're encouraged to think out of the box, and he says Vajrayana is thinking out of the box while you're still in the box. And this is actually what we're doing with the Vajrayana. Of course, that is also where it's so tricky. We might think we're out of the box, while in fact we are in the box, thinking we're out of the box. But it's not so much actually even that we are in the box, but it's that we exist beyond box fundamentally. And so we have a self-imposed box that we struggle with. And the Vajrayana is really introducing the reality beyond box as a wider perspective already when we are within our delusional self-imposed box. So it's a very realistic perspective. There's never ever anything in the Vajrayana that is, you could say, mystical as such. It's very much about relating to what is. And this is also where the preceding chapter, non-theistic energy, is so valuable in terms of understanding that what we're doing here is not fabricating a philosophy or trying to excuse the pain of our reality. It's very much about us looking directly at our experience and fully understanding the nature of this experience without trying to put up buffers of what we then could call theism and what we in Madhyamaka or the middle way teaching talk about as extremes. You can say conceptual reference points. We could actually have reality raw, and that's so much what we're doing with the context of going beyond our ordinary crutches of trying to construct some excuse or some ways of filtering or handling our reality, and we do that in a very unimaginative way. So of course, within the Vajrayana, there is a lot of emphasis on this primordial purity, and that, of course, is what could be hijacked, misunderstood, misappropriated, and so forth, that could cause some stumbling for those on the path. It could very often end up in a disgraceful way. But like Rinpoche was saying, it also in many, many cases has produced remarkable individuals. And luckily to this day, we have extraordinary teachers. And we're presently studying the work of one such teacher, Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was able to communicate in a culture completely different from the one he originally was born into, and yet doing so as if he was a complete insider. And yet he has a message that goes far beyond any any perspectives and knowledge and understanding that has really been prevalent within this so-called modern culture. So there's a tremendous message to be passed on, and there's an incredible conduit for doing that, namely Trungpa Rinpoche. And of course, in addition to Trungpa Rinpoche, also there's so many great masters that still are with us. So in that sense, where we sit here in our webinar context, and are extremely fortunate really to have access to this. Okay, so we're presently in chapter of, well, actually, yes. Good thing I have set it up so I remind myself. We of course start, and this is also really premise for thinking out of the box, being able to go beyond our limited imaginations and so forth, to actually be able to connect with this greater scope of being, if you like. Then we rely on an openness and a trust, which we can call devotion. And this devotion is really a vehicle for connecting with greatness, not greatness in an abstract sense, but also very much greatness in something that abides as something living within us. And this living quality is invoked through connecting with other living persons who have done what we intend to do. And so we, so much in the Buddhist teaching, because this is a living tradition of experience, actual realization, we invoke the lineage. And so before proceeding with the teaching here, Trungpa Rinpoche starts off with this practice that we have in the Vajrayana called calling the Guru from afar. And in there, this is a liturgy composed by a great ecumenical master called Jamgon Kongtrul Rinpoche, who invokes all the what we call practice lineages of Tibetan Buddhism. So we've looked at the lineage of the well, you could say the original lineage as it exists in terms of enlightenment, and then the lineage as it exists as it comes down to us presently through the lineages that was transmitted in India and Tibet. And we've looked at what in the Tibetan context is known as the old translation. Then we've looked at the tradition known as the Kadampa tradition, that of Atisha. We looked at the lineage of the Kagyu masters, including the three fathers of the Kagyu master lineage, the masters Mila, Mapa, Mila, and Gamboba, and then particularly then what is very prominent in the Kagyu lineage nowadays, the great Kamapa lineage. And then we're looking now at the Sakya tradition. The Sakya tradition is an extremely venerable tradition that also to this day is alive and well, and which was founded back in the 11th century by some great masters, the contemporary of Mapa the translator, and also Atisha, namely the masters Konchok Gyalpo. Well, there was a Drogmi Lotsa, then somebody called Konchok Gyalpo. And then we have, after Konchok Gyalpo, then the essentially Konchok Gyalpo's family, but these great masters are then known, 5 masters, which are known as the 5 Sakya forefathers. And here you have a tanka where up in the middle you have a great master called Sachin Kunga Nyingpo. Then you have his 2 sons, Lobun Sunam Tsemo and Jetsun Chakwa Gyaltsen. And then you have the great master Sakya Pandita, and then finally a great master called Chögyam. And there's so much to be said about these, but let me just, what I'd like to emphasize is the purity of this lineage in terms of their practice, both of, you could say, the rational understanding of the sutra lineage, the vehicle of characteristics, and then the practice of the Vajrayana. And Sakyapas, very pure holders of this lineage, and very much the inspiration, and that's my point here, really comes from, of course, the enlightenment of these masters, but particular Sachin Kunga Nyingpo, who, like some people have referred to him as the gatekeeper of the Dharma, and he really ensured that, and he instilled actually, he actually instilled quite a bit of respect across the line in Tibet, actually scolding a lot of the abuse of the particular Vajrayana teaching and making fun of how it could be misunderstood, not in a sort of simple-minded way, but very much in praising the value of this, how important it was to uphold the Buddha's teaching purely. And that's how he really was basic to an entire spirit within Tibetan Buddhism of upholding the purity of what was given to the Tibetans from India. And thanks to him very much, we have in Tibetan Buddhism really a sort of tradition of custodians that have upheld the lineages and the view and practice of Buddhism as it came down from India. And to such an extent that Tibetans would never dream of talking about something called Tibetan Buddhism. It simply doesn't exist in the Tibetan Dharma vocabulary. Of course, they'll say, well, we Tibetans who are Buddhists, etc. But there's never a notion that anything was invented in Tibet. Everything had to be exactly as it was practiced in India. And so that's where what you often hear in sort of anthropological circles and so on, you have this sort of notion that Buddhism in Tibet was mixed up with Tibetan beliefs, which is not. Of course, as also Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche was talking about over this weekend, the skillful means of the path is very often tied up with culture. But the actual methods and the actual view of Buddhism as you have it in Tibet, thanks to the likes of Sachin Kunga Nyingpo, was actually preserved in its purity. So you couldn't, obviously, Tibetan lamas would to some extent have practice things that look Tibetan, but when it comes to all the actual Dharma practice, and that goes for the entire Vajrayana, by the way, as well as the foundation, the Pratimoksha and the practices of the Mahayana and so on, all of these meticulously uphold the purity in terms of view and practice as it comes down from India. So that's very much thanks to Sachin Kunga Nyingpo. And so here Jamgon Kongtrul writes, 5 Sakya forefathers, Jetsuns, think of me. Look upon me from the realm of inseparable samsara and nirvana. Help me to unite the completely pure view, meditation, and action, and walk upon the supreme secret path. So the view of inseparable samsara and nirvana is particularly then to the Sakya lineage, is recognizing that regardless of whether or not we are confused, whether or not we are confused or enlightened, the nature of reality remains, remains absolutely. The nature of reality is unchanging, regardless of whether there's samsara and nirvana, and insight into that then enables the practice of meditation and its integration through action. And so taking that resultant view as the path, which is then the Sakya practice of taking the result as the path, then we supplicate these masters that we may succeed in doing so. So, the Sakyapas. Okay, transmission. So, Chapter 5, Transmission, Trungpa Rinpoche says, our next topic is the transmission of Vajrayana teachings from teacher to student. Before we can discuss transmission, however, it seems necessary to go back a step and examine our level of sanity and discipline. We need to examine what we have accomplished in our relationship with the world. If we have not been able to make a relationship with our suffering, frustrations, and neurosis, the feasibility of transmission is remote, extremely remote, for we have not even made a proper relationship with the most basic level of our existence. Now this is where Trungpa Rinpoche excels, and this is where Trungpa Rinpoche famously would take the students from being in a condition of, somewhat naive assumptions around what the spiritual path is, very hopeful, and basically Trungpa Rinpoche famously would take his students back to the kitchen sink level, very much insist that the students make friends with themselves, with their culture, and so forth. And that's where Trungpa Rinpoche put tremendous effort into laying the groundwork in which actually proper transmission could take place, and very much emphasized this the importance of actually relating with what we experience rather than what we dream of, cutting through spiritual materialism, and enabling students to actually begin to have a proper ground in terms of what they really were about. And that's where something like suffering cannot just be left as something, oh yeah, well, I have nervous conditions, and I'm taking some pills for it, and but I love my Buddhist practice, and we do beautiful singing, and we have lovely rituals, and all that personal stuff of mine. Well, that's just something that nobody needs to know about, and I won't bother the teacher with that. And I just love the bake sales and the community, what have you. And that's where, unfortunately, liberation will consist of us freeing ourselves from our suffering, from our limitations, going beyond the more or less conscious assumptions we have about ourselves, our existence, reality, and so forth. So that's where the whole path is founding on relating with our actual ground, which is our experience, and not about going straight for the dessert and trying to just have something that makes us forget reality. And so Trungpa Rinpoche continues, I could say to you, forget all that, forget your pain and suffering. It is going to be okay. Trungpa Rinpoche says, I could give you all kinds of antidotes, tranquilizers, mantras, and tricks. I could say, soon you'll feel good, soon you'll forget your pain, and then you'll be in a beautiful place. But that would be an enormous falsity, and in the long run, such an approach is ungenerous and extremely destructive to the spiritual path. It is like giving our children tranquilizers whenever they begin to misbehave, so that they will fall asleep. It saves us the trouble of getting a babysitter and changing diapers, but the child becomes a complete zombie. That is not the human thing to do, we must admit, and giving someone a spiritual tranquilizer is just as primitive as that. We suffer tremendously if we treat spirituality in that way, and we have to pay for it later on. Enormous problems arise, both resentment and discontent. And I'll say, as somebody who's been witness to, participant in the importation of Buddhism in the modern world over quite some time, I can only emphasize this point as being possibly the biggest challenge for Buddhism in the modern world, is this unwillingness to actually work with oneself, actually do the bother to look into an understanding of what the path is about, and actually do the hard yards in terms of properly practicing. And this is, without that, then all the beautiful, wonderful things of the culture of enlightenment that we have in Buddhism just becomes a distraction. And like Trungpa Rinpoche says, without properly relating and just using the path as a sort of spiritual tranquilizers, then resentment arises, discontentment. People will say, eventually people will begin to become more and more angry at the teaching, saying, the teaching is saying, promising me this, I'm not getting it, it's not happening, and I think I'd rather just, forget it all, and so on. And this is really doesn't come from a flaw in the teaching, but it comes from a flaw in the appropriation and the integration of the teaching. And this, of course, is not that it's anybody's fault. It's not that people are bad because they do that. It's just really, you could say, lost in translation between when Buddhism travels from one culture to the next, and kind lamas come in and the students will say, oh, we love that wonderful teaching of yours, and then the teacher says, of course, and then when the students are bored, then they want another teaching. And this way, there's never ever really a time of relating to oneself, and rather it's just all this fascination with the splendor and the glitz. What's the word? Bling. A glitz is also a word, right? But anyway, the bling of the teaching, which just is a complete distraction. So Trungpa says, one approach that is used in presenting spirituality is to say that if we have any questions, we should just forget them. We should regard them as outside the circle of the spiritually initiated. We should forget all our negativity. Don't ask questions, just drop them. It is important that you have hope, there that you go beyond your questions. Only if you accept the whole thing will you be saved. That strategy is used to take advantage of the sanity of human beings, which is unlawful. And again, this is where we would have a situation of not only, you could say, naivete from the point of view of the teacher and the student, but also actual exploitation. And I personally experienced this in the early days when we were a bunch of young hippies in Denmark, where great lamas kindly visited, and there was such a sense of love and light, the proverbial love and lighties. And asking questions was just not there. If you had any doubts, you're being initiated into something just incredibly esoteric, and you should just be happy. You shouldn't ask too many questions, and sort of questioning whether this isn't very reminiscent to the religion that we had all decided to drop and forget and so forth was highly unwelcome. And the premise was, just don't doubt, and your ego will fall away, and you'll see the light. And so that's where what Trungpa is talking about here certainly was a reality back then and still is. Someone may tell us that, Trungpa says, if we commit ourselves to a particular practice or path, within 4 weeks we're going to be okay. We're going to be high forever. So we try it, and it works, but not forever. After 6 weeks at most, or perhaps only after 10 days, we begin to come down. And then we begin to panic and wonder what is going on. Usually the most faithful students blame themselves, feeling they have mismanaged the practice. I must have some problem that I haven't cleared up yet. I must not have done my confession properly or given in properly. But that is not the case at all. The problem is that the way they were indoctrinated into their spiritual practice. We accept what is presented to us with an open mind, which is beautiful. But then its truth does not hold up. Because of the basic deception involved in our initiation, all sorts of holes begin to develop. Unfortunately, we become the victim of those lies, deceptions, or charlatanisms, and we feel the effects constantly over and over again. And the deception here lies in, as we mentioned above, we should just forget our questions. We should just forget our critical thinking. We should just believe. Open your heart and you'll be blessed, sort of thing. And that's where the implication of opening our heart is to let go of all our critical thinking, all our basic intelligence, and basically just buy into something that we deep down have no idea really what involves. And so we're operating within a situation of some assumed belief that really doesn't really hold up on anything. It's not based on anything. And the last thing is actually it doesn't have any relationship to our actual experience. So Trungpa Rinpoche continues. So we have a problem with spiritual transmission, a problem of how to get real transmission from a competent master into our system. At this point, we're talking purely about the beginner's level and the preparations that might be needed in order for spiritual transmission to occur in the very early stages. It is necessary for us to sharpen our cynicism, to sharpen our whole critical attitude towards what we're doing. That cynicism provides a basis for our study and work. For instance, if we're building a bridge, we begin by constructing the framework. It could be made of timber or iron rods, but the skeleton must be built before we pour the concrete. That is an example of the cynical approach. It is absolutely necessary to have that kind of cynical attitude if we're going to build a bridge. It's necessary to be cynical in our approach to spirituality as well. And that is where we need to begin with actually being rational. We could say the path is not ultimately about being rational. But the thing about rationality, it is what Trungpa Rinpoche also in one place refers to as Vajra intelligence. It's that it's something that's undeniable. See, you might feel inspired one day and the lineage blessing is present, and then it's a rainy day and you just resent that you're doing what you're doing and that you're this lineage, aren't they just all exploiting me or laughing at me and so forth. So that's where our sort of devotion, and Padampa Sanja also makes a point about that. He says, practice now because devotion, it might last, it might not last. And so there has to be a cynical or highly rational approach that constitutes a Vajra intelligence that understands that 2 + 2 is 4. It doesn't matter if it's a rainy day or if the sun is shining. We know that's the hard facts. 2 and 2 makes 4. And also when we begin to understand how our self-imposed limitations, our neurosis, works in terms of undermining our own happiness, then this insight into the true nature of our neurosis and the constructed and you could say workable nature of our neurosis is something that we will recognize whether or not we feel inspired, whether or not we want to work with the neurosis. We won't be able to deny that neurosis as it sits within us is both the problem and the solution. And so to have some basic understanding of that is essential. This does not mean we have to be a scholar. Sometimes people think, well, I'm not a scholar. I just like to go, follow my bliss. I'm the devotional type. I'm the bhakti type. I don't need to know all of this. But again, what happens at the end is depression, resentment, discontent, because there's not really the foundation of actually working with who we are is not there. And so this is where it is so important again to have this foundation. Trungpa Rinpoche continues, we need to encourage an attitude of constant questioning rather than ignoring our intelligence, which is a genuine part of our potential as students. If students were required to drop their questions, that would create armies and armies of zombies, rows of jellyfish sitting next to each other. But to use a local expression, that is not so neat. In fact, it is messy. Preparing a beautifully defined and critical background for what we're doing to ourselves and what the teaching is doing to us is absolutely important, absolutely important. Without that critical background, we cannot develop even the slightest notion or flavor of enlightenment. So again, there might even be peer pressure within the Sangha. And again, this is something I've experienced where, you shouldn't ask questions, just go with it. Don't be so difficult. And there's not really a compassionate sense of us living within a cultural context which has absolutely no idea about enlightenment. And shouldn't we ask questions on behalf of not just the culture around us, but on behalf of the part of ourselves that's brought up in that culture? And that is where we can't all of a sudden begin to dress like Tibetans and act like Tibetans. Okay, I don't know if I'm throwing in too many personal anecdotes here, but I remember cutting through spiritual materialism in Tashijong in India in 1975. And as I was sitting and reading, cutting through spiritual materialism, I was actually spinning a prayer wheel. I had bought a beautiful big old Tibetan prayer wheel. It wasn't even that old, and it was in really good nick, and I was very happy. I was spinning prayer wheels like you do, when you live in Tashijong in 1975. And so there I was, and I was obviously dressed in Tibetan, I think I had jeans, but I had a Tibetan sort of, the Tibetan shirt and all of that, and, tons of blessing cords around my neck and, my mala, the works, And then Trungpa just says, you can go to India and you can live with the Tibetans and, you can absorb Tibetan cultural mannerisms. And I was looking at myself and thinking, that kind of fits the description, doesn't it? So there has to be, of course, we can learn a lot, but we also have to be so true about where we're coming from. And I remember at the time I was thinking, wonder if I can walk with my prayer wheel in the streets of Copenhagen when I'm back, because all Tibetans would always walk around with prayer wheels, like Gachin Rinpoche always has his prayer wheel, right? And so I was thinking, can I use it? Then no, I should just be honest to it and do it, But the tension implicit in that whole thought is really my background, my culture, and my background, and I can't deny that I grew up loving Bob Dylan and all sorts of, authors within the sort of general, angst-ridden, modernity. And so much of that heritage was part of me, plus critical thinking, what are you supposed to believe that you think when you're told to visualize yourself as a deity, etc., right? So all of these amount really to the fact that we absolutely need to bring into this project cynicism. I usually think cynicism is a little bit, it's like skepticism taken too far. But Trungpa Rinpoche is using the word here, and of course it just means to be really critical. So that's where the real, you could say, Vajra ground is laid. Trungpa Rinpoche says enlightenment is based on both prajna, or discriminating awareness, and compassion. But without cynicism, we do not have either. We do not have any compassion for ourselves because we're looking for something outside of ourselves and we want to find the best way to get it. We also do not have any prajna or clarity. We become completely gullible and we're liable to be sucked in without any understanding, none whatsoever. So again, quoting Trungpa Rinpoche from, I think, Myth of Freedom, where he says, the spiritual path could quite simply be understood in terms of stepping out of self-deception. And this is what prajna facilitates. Prajna, which is shown as the sword of Manjushri, it's what cuts through the critical thinking that cuts through the deception that drives samsara. So that is the discriminating awareness. And also then with that, the softness that begins to be at home within the real world. So that's where without that intelligence, then we're just going to be focused on a goal that has nothing to do with what is actually us, what is actually the real price of eggs. Transmission, Trungpa Rinpoche says, is like receiving a spiritual inheritance. In order to inherit our spiritual discipline, in order to have a good inheritance, we should become worthy vessels. In order to become worthy vessels, we have to drop the attitude that we're going to be saved, that there's going to be a magically painless operation, and that all we have to do is pay the doctor's fee. We have a notion that if we pay the doctor, everything will be taken care of. We can just relax and let him do what he wants. That attitude is simple-minded. It is absolutely necessary to think twice. The questioning mind is absolutely necessary. It is the basis of receiving transmission. And also, when we go to the doctor, yes, it's very simple if the doctor, he or she just takes care of us, right? And we just like to take the pill and everything would be fine. But again, aren't we all brought up in a critically thinking culture? And aren't we taught to be analytical? Haven't we had enough stories, about corrupted spirituality? And also our friends around us who see us just sort of leaning into some sort of practice of a culture that has nothing to do with the sort of experience of modern life, they'll just say, well, it looks like we've just adopted a dogma, a religion, sort of something where we just, on the basis of blind faith, are tagging along. So that's where there is no way that we could actually do this without actually being completely involved, without this being completely about working with who we are. And that is then what would make us worthy vessels, that we are honest and that we are genuine and working with ourselves. Trungpa Rinpoche is saying, I'm not stressing the importance of critical intelligence because Buddhism is just now being introduced to America and the West. It is not that I think students here might be more gullible, Buddhism is a strong tradition that has existed for 2,500 years, and throughout the ages, students have been given these same instructions. Throughout the ages, they have contributed their neurosis and the mistakes to help shape the methods and means of the Buddhist lineage. A learning process has been taking place for 2,500 years, in fact, even longer. And we have inherited all of that experience. So this approach is ages old rather than a sudden panic. It is an old way, very old and very traditional. So spiritual materialism and naivete around the spiritual path has been around as long as there's been confusion, ego, and the proposition of enlightenment. And this is then what Trungpa is saying. It's not like it's just now that all of a sudden, in the modern context, we have to be critical. Certainly, we don't have the resource of an already existing tradition as such. And there is an added tension in the meeting between, you could say, two sciences. But that tension in itself actually sparks a greater insight and greater confidence. So this process of surrendering our neurosis and so on is something that we share together. We share that with Tilopa and Naropa and Garab Dorje and Manjushri Mitra and so forth. All the masters down to the present day have all gone through what we need to go through. So there's nothing particularly new about this. Trungpa says one of the responsibilities of the lineage holder is not to give an inch, but to keep up the tradition. At this point, tradition does not mean dressing up in robes and playing exotic music or having dakinis dancing around us or anything like that. Tradition is being faithful to what we have been taught and to our own integrity. From this point of view, tradition is being awake and open, welcoming, but at the same time stubborn. So again, coming back to Jameng Kinze, who was this weekend, he was speaking about how from he was born until now, he's only done one thing, which is study the works of this man called Siddhartha. And what life has taught him is that Siddhartha got it right. And unless we should listen to him. And this is where there is this, and this is part of our journey, is that we're continually, not through retreating into the tradition, but actually following the inspiration of the tradition to investigate reality. Then it is that we arrive at this condition of awakening and opening. But that again comes from the commitment, the stubbornness. Trungpa just says then, according to tradition, the teacher should treat his students in this stubborn way. He or she should require that his students practice properly in accordance with the tradition of the lineage. There are problems when a teacher is too kind to students who do not belong to the teacher's race and upbringing. Some teachers from these seem too excited by foreigners. Wow, finally we're going to teach the some teachers from the East seem to be excited by foreigners. Wow, finally we're going to teach the aliens, the overseas people. Because of this fascination and out of a naive generosity, they make unnecessary concessions. Although such teachers may be liberal enough to include Occidental students, to take them to heart and be very kind to them, the extraordinary kindness may be destructive. And that is, of course, also where we see students who don't have the grounding and preparation. They might say, oh, we don't need to do the preliminary practices, or could we do a shorter version of the preliminary practices, or could we just skip the preliminary practices, and can we also skip the main practice, and can't you just say that we already are enlightened, and isn't that good enough? Can you just say that we should settle into the nature of mind and not do anything else? And then the teacher will say, oh yes, okay, well here's and then without the students ever having related to actually what's really there, they'll be given instructions that actually will just leave them without a clue about how to deal with their everyday reality, and then be part of a community that basically lives on the moon and does strange Tibetan things or whatever, wherever the teachers might come from. So in that sense, this is possibly looked at as on kindness. They might say, oh, this teacher, he really teaches according to the modern world. But no. And Trungpa more than anyone understanding the modern world, saw that there was nothing there was actually nothing in the lineage that wasn't relevant to the modern world. But what the modern world didn't have was a foundation that prepared them for the reality of the path. And so Trungpa Rinpoche's emphasis on creating, on the foundations, absolutely essential then for approaching higher teachings like Nundro and like the Vajrayana teachings. And of course, this also is reflected in while Trungpa Rinpoche had a very clear, structured approach, and also this also is reflected in the less linear, less structured approach of many other great teachers who have taught in the West, who have made sure that students really get a foundation. And so within the context of other sanghas, notably, I know about the ones around me, from Chögyam Khyentse Rinpoche, Tukapyong Ongyal, Jigme Khyentse Rinpoche, and so forth. Then there has been very much this process of preparing the modern students who lack that that foundation culturally to enable them to actually begin to properly work with what is the foundations of the path. And that is from there that every little aspect of the path makes sense. There's not an ounce of excess fat on the Buddhist teaching and the Buddhist methods. It's really just about understanding the intention and then applying them given our particular context. So we have this situation then where there might be these concessions made because the students are not really prepared. So that happens. So Trungpa Rinpoche, such teachers regard Westerners as extraordinary species, as if they came from the planet Mars. Well, why don't we teach them? Since we have a captive audience of living Martians here. That misunderstanding is an expression of limited vision, of failing to see that the world is one world made up of human beings. A person who lives on this earth needs food, shelter, clothing, a love affair, and so on. We are all alike in that regard. Westerners do not need any special treatment because they invented the airplane or electronics. All human beings have the same psychology. They think in the same way. They have the same requirements as students. The question is simply how one can teach students no matter where they come from. And that is, of course, then where we need to understand the objective. Also, something Rinpoche was talking about, the objective of the path. And then we have, yes, the method. And the objective is something that is entirely beyond culture. The method can adapt to culture, but at the same time, there are certain aspects of the method that that is universal. Sitting practice, the practice of shamatha, relating to our neurosis, beginning to see beyond our neurosis, discovering a wider perspective, beginning to discover the others, sharing oneself with the world, allowing openness to the world. All of these are communicated in terms of methods, and both the method and the objective are universal. So the question is about how to really engage the students, engage students so that, or engage us students so that we're relating to this universal dimension. Okay. Let's see if there's any questions. I would imagine there is. Okay. So, buongiorno. About spiritual tranquilizer, it seems that Christianity has been giving spiritual tranquilizers and the believers are content with the heaven after death. Possibly. Presently, we're not talking about Christianity, so we're a little bit dealing with just, you could say, our own situation here as practitioners of Buddhism. Of course, many of us have opted to not practice some of the other paths for a reason, but presently we We'll just focus on Buddhism, I think. Would you say studying some texts like Madhyamaka and contemplating similar to asking questions? Very much. Madhyamaka, unfortunately, is very often presented. Madhyamaka, and like quoting Woolston Fletcher, or probably others have made this observation as well. I think Woolston was quoting somebody, but Madhyamaka is not so much a philosophy as a system of critique. It is undermining dogma. It's undermining the assumptions that drive suffering. And that's where even philosophies are seen as simply just conceptual reference points. And that's where Madhyamaka is very much the critique, that which critiques the reference points of holding on to concepts and dogma. And as such, and the beauty about Madhyamaka is it doesn't replace it. Of course, that's where people would say, oh, someone like Nagarjuna is very cheeky because, he would criticize and dismantle the logic and expose the flaws of philosophical systems without actually replacing them. But I think everybody can recognize the beauty of that we could actually exist beautifully without dogma. But in doing so, then what we now had, and this is where the Tibetans were remarkable custodians, is a heritage of refutations that were presented and put forward in India. And so when you study Madhyamaka, you're very much often confronted with some refutations that are related to the Indian situation and Indian philosophy. And that's where we can hope that in the future we will have some refutations that address the belief systems that are particular to modernity, the dogmas of modernity, which are run very deep. And so while the refutations that we have of the old systems in India that fall under what we call the headings of nihilism and eternalism, they of course are universal and equally apply within the modern context. The language can be prohibitive, and so it's very often difficult for us who study Madhyamaka to sort of relate to how the refutations apply to our particular dogmas, particularly because our dogmas aren't really even talked about in the Madhyamaka teaching. But that said, the gist of the Madhyamaka teaching is so important. So that is where it's important to just, you could say, go there and familiarize ourselves with it. And this is where we then can personally begin to do the translation of how these refutations apply to some of the assumptions we have in our belief systems. Does one need to actually challenge teachers? We need to, above all, Madhyamaka is about challenging our own beliefs. So of course, these beliefs are sometimes referred to as external, you could say, philosophical systems, but they in fact are about our own personal assumptions. Regarding devotion and critical thinking mentions, seems to me that there is a very thin line dividing devotion and faith in the way we want it to develop in us, and the critical thinking that is deceitful or self-preserving. How can, as beginners, tell? Is there something such as too much devotion and faith and too much or too quickly? Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good question. And again, I think Trungpa, I think it's a good thing you're bringing up this question, but this question that you're bringing up really is answered in what Trungpa is saying here. And that's where you could say the one line answer is to be honest. We need to be honest to ourselves and to be willing to think critically and ask questions. And then we could say we can give as now we're on the Buddhist path, we can give the Buddha the benefit of the doubt and saying, he might have the answers. And maybe if I think about it, if I scrutinize what the Buddha says, maybe the answer will help for us. So you could say there's somebody who's showing us something, but we need to validate whether or not it applies. Okay. I have been contemplating the comparison of the devotion of a suicide bomber to that of genuine master with genuine devotion. I understand that the former is following a wrong view, but was considering if you took the devotion itself. It is quite remarkable the strength the suicide bomb has in that, as seemingly has no doubt. I guess what we're saying here is that devotion, despite the wrong view, is also something that is fickle, as they themselves have no ground in understanding in what they're doing, as it is blind. Or is there something more than you can pin as a difference further than the wrong view in terms of their energy and devotion? That's a very long question, and it's hard for me right away to exactly get it right. But certainly, yes, you could say the suicide bomber is remarkable, but also the suicide bomber then isn't left with a nagging doubt. Whatever doubt that might come is sort of, in theory at least, sort of literally blown up. And so that's where you don't, us who are not suicide bombers, we're going to have to live with that self-deceit. So that's where we need to, the trust and the devotion should come from critical thinking. If we begin by being critical and we then see how the truth and the validity of the teaching is obvious, when we think critically using a rational mind before we have faith, then we arrive at an honest conclusion about, yes, this is valid, this person is trustworthy, this teaching holds, this logic holds, then devotion takes place. So that's like a love affair. You know, you first need to scrutinize the other person, and you're not in love to begin with, but as you begin to sort of know the person, then you begin to develop a trust, and then you could have develop a deep bond. And that's where the critical thinking really precedes then devotion. That's where we can talk about, what is it? Faith as the doorway, sorry, doubt as the doorway to faith. I hope that answers your question. After reading pieces of Diogenes' story, I don't think cynicism these days compares well to its origins. It seems it's more about analyzing the things we normally do unquestioningly. Okay. So, okay. Sorry, my Greek pronunciation there, Diogenes, is that what his name is? Anyway, so on the basis of reading that, then your comment is, I don't think cynicism these days compares well to its origins. Okay, all right, thank you. Many of us may be brought up in a culture that encourages critical thinking, yet somehow most seem to have a fixed mentality, an approach of problem, reaction, solution mentality. Yes, well, that's the thing. We very often actually, we would like to think of ourselves as critical, but we're very comfortable to just settle in. Something works, we settle into a particular attitude. And then we also, despite being brought up with critical thinking, we, at one point, we sort of stop being critical sometimes. Yeah. But yes, if it works, then that's good enough. Yeah. To benefit from cynicism, don't we need someone like you, this person is implying, to counter our irrational doubts immediately? If we don't have that, might we stop ourselves from getting past our cynicism through to the truth? Well, I mean, what happens with teachers is very often they're so remarkable. You know, I was talking with a friend yesterday about how, at the end of the day, really, it's about the beauty of the teacher that really, or the qualities of the teacher's enlightenment that really is the last word in terms of trusting a path. And yes, that's true. But then again, the teacher is not going to be there as a savior. And ultimately, we will need to, yes, the teacher is what will get us, you could say, hooked or begin to trust or suspect there's some truth happening here. But for our journey, we then need to begin to, you could say, listen to what the teacher says. We can't just sit and say, oh, the teacher's wonderful. As much as the teacher then, you could say, is the proof of the validity of the path, then we need to have a cynicism and an honesty that is about seeing what are we doing with ourselves. Can you speak a bit about making friends with yourself, the foundation of knowing your experience and knowing what to accept at the moment and what aspects to disregard. This is a big one, and this is basic to the entire journey of meditation. Trungpa Rinpoche talks a lot about it in what's called mindfulness in action, and it is really based on the honesty that we can. There's the inspiration from the teacher that we can be honest, that we don't live, and the inspiration of the teaching is that the bottom line of reality is goodness. There's a basic goodness, and that we need to begin to intuit in terms of working with ourselves, and that is where we need the dual modality of intellectual analysis and sitting practice, where we give up analysis, where we just sit. And that's where we begin to touch on reality, and we begin to see, it's good, you know. What is it? On the seventh day he rested and he saw it was good, or something like that. We need to do that. And I would say making friends with ourselves is beginning to be honest, and here the medicine, the Dharma, will be something like we say, it's good in the beginning, middle, and end. Right from the moment we begin to connect with the Dharma, we'll begin to connect with the goodness that is ours. Please say a bit more about our neurosis being both a problem and the solution. You know, many years ago, I was sitting with the Ziga Contra Rinpoche, and Rinpoche was very young at the time. He was maybe 19 or something, and he wrote these one-liners. And I remember one was never seek the solution outside of the problem. And I remember I wrote down these one-liners, and I had them in notebooks for years, and now they've gone lost. But I remember this this one here, and that is, yes, because it's through our neurosis that we discover liberation. You know, it's thanks to us looking at our neurosis. You know, and sometimes we have good friends that can also help us recognize our neurosis. And you know, in general, the Sangha experience is very much about neurosis. You know, it's not like we get together and we hold hands and we all chant Om and everything's wonderful. It's that we're working, we're works in progress. But the promise of the neurosis is that it's workable, it's manageable. It's like Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, he said when he said to people taking refuge, the most important thing is that you recognize your confusion is removable. So our liberation lies in working with the problem. And so discovering you could say the transparency, the workability, the potential for liberation that lies in neurosis is really where the solution and liberation lies. Lots to be said about that, so I said a bit more. Okay. It seems a contradiction in what he is saying about following tradition, because Trungpa Rinpoche's approach was quite abstract and even wild, and his students did nundros very quickly. Well, let me just stop there, because it seems there's a long question coming up here. Well, the thing is, Trungpa Rinpoche's students didn't do nundro very quickly. They did nundro after years of study, and after years of sitting, and after sitting where they sometimes had to do what we call datu, an entire month of just sitting practice. So there's nothing abstract or wild. That's the sort of unfortunate problem with the internet nowadays. When you go in and you read, you know, sort of the, I don't know, Denver Post version of what Trungpa Rinpoche is doing, you know, you're going to get some pretty confused interpretations of it. So I'm going to have to be quite clear that there's no contradiction here. Trungpa Rinpoche really was very real. Abstract, no. Trungpa Rinpoche had his students go and get jobs. He had his students begin to go back to the society they had rejected, begin to practice spiritual discipline, and so on. So then this comment continues. Teachers have created shorter nundros so students can both clean up their personal lives at a kitchen sink level while practicing at the same time and not delaying. What is the point of what he is saying about tradition? Well, I'm sure there are, you know, teachers will do many different things. The main point really is that the teachers are enabling the students to work with their neurosis. So if they are relating to the kitchen sink level and are practicing, that's very good. So that is the tradition. The point is we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh well, we're going to forget the tradition, because there's so much know-how, and to have people in a culture where Buddhism is only a very new phenomenon begin to sort of direct the show is a little bit sort of might not be that helpful. That's what I think, my 2 cents. A few talks ago, I understood you to associate cynicism with the dogmas of modernity, which disappointed me, because I recall my attraction to Buddhism came from, and then the question continues, came from a joy in the cheerful cynicism of the Buddhist community in Boulder in the early 80s. Glad that cynicism came up today in a better light. Good, let's forget about what I said, and that's entirely my private interpretation of cynicism. So it's good we have cynicism, but we have it redeemed. I'm glad, and you're absolutely right. This was the strength of Trungpa Rinpoche's approach, of course, and the Buddhist community around him was this celebration of very good, cheerful cynicism. Excellent. So, of course, what I mean and what I was intending to see is there's a place where, you sometimes have these, like the skeptical society, where you have these people who have actually a dogma. And I'm sorry, there's a place where, whether we call it skepticism or cynicism, where we can just be so caught up that we say, I believe in nothing. And that is really the belief in nothing. And this is where, if we're talking about the cheerful joy of cynicism that Trungpa Rinpoche was promoting, it was about something that cuts through the nonsense and opens up to a wider perspective. Whereas you could just have a sort of a cult of just, doggedly, believing in nothing and sticking with that belief. Yeah. So, could you please recommend a book good to start with Madhyamika teachings? That's such a difficult question, because they tend to be very difficult. Then, hold on. There's Trungpa Rinpoche, who did a book called The Open Door to Emptiness. There's also Khenchen Pema Sherab, who did Khenchen Pema Sherab, Palden Sherab, who did a work on Madhyamika. But I must say, it's the best I have come across are actually introductions by Woolston Fletcher to some of the Madhyamika translations from the Padmakara Translation Committee, and that's really just introductions. But there is out there. Also, what's a very good classical scripture would I like to refer to? Yeah, it's true. There's also Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche's teaching on the Madhyamika. That's right. Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche's teachings on Madhyamika. Yes, that's highly recommended, obviously. But it's big. That's the thing. It's big, and Rinpoche goes through a lot. But of course, Rinpoche's teaching is so delightful. So even though it's a big read, it's very inspiring, yeah. But there's a classical place really where the teaching on the middle way and dependent arising and so on, it's called the rice seedling. And if you look in the 84,000 library, there's this sutra called the rice seedling, which is such a good place actually to begin approaching the understanding of Madhyamika, which is basically understanding dependent arising. Yeah. So someone says, agree with that comment. Okay. This is not, I'm not sure when that comment was made though. I am thinking of our global scenario at present. Okay. We're going a little bit over time here. Okay. So anyway, there's only one question left. Okay. I'm thinking about our global scenario at present: problem, virus, reaction, fear, solution, restriction, vaccinations, war and virus, etc. Well, all I can say is you're not the only one. And yes, we're all thinking about that. Then again, we are looking at a whole world of shifting conditions, what's continually happening. And this falls into what Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche was talking about in terms of the Tri Lakshana, or the 3 marks or 3 characteristics of existence, which is impermanence, all composite phenomena impermanent, suffering, you could say all neurosis is suffering, and selflessness, that there's nothing that stands up as having its own identity. So that's where our pointing the fingers at so-and-so as being evil or bad, or the situation being bad, is really just a question of us, the way that we label a reality. So yes, but we are all thinking that the best I would say is to practice the Dharma and do prayers. Could you please speak of the name of Rinpoche's Madhyamika book? It's called it's called what is can somebody remember? It's Madhyamika. If you go to, it used to be on Khensa Foundation. You could go in and you could download it. I think introduction to Madhyamika or something. Anyway, I'm sure you can Google it. Yeah. I have listened to Alex Trisolio's video commentary on Rinpoche's teachings on Madhyamika and find it very wonderful. Yes, I think even Alex got hold of the madhyamika.org, how do you say, web address. So yes, that's warmly recommended. So perhaps the book title, Journey Without Goal, expresses well aspects of today's studies. Indeed. Okay, all right. Introduction to the Middle Way. Good. Introduction to the Middle Way. Thank you. So yes, so if you either on the Khensa Foundation website or the Siddhartha's Intent website, it used to be that you just need to type in the request and then you can download it. Yeah. And it's free for download in Siddhartha's Intent. Thank you. All right. Thank you very much for joining in this study, and we'll dedicate the merit. Through this virtue, may all beings throughout existence awaken together without a single being left behind. In the pure realm of the luminous essence, the ground of the great perfection, may they remain inseparable from the kayas and wisdoms. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we are born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together.